I'm Jason Louv. This is the Ultra Culture Podcast, and it's my honor today to have on Dr. Stephen Edred Flowers, who you'll definitely know if you've been around the occult world at all for the last few decades. He's been a major player and incredibly prominent in the revival of the rune system and the northern tradition of magic, which definitely emerged in the late 70s and early 80s and then definitely in the 90s as a completely new current of magic. Definitely people were attracted to the original German current of magic and neo-paganism instead of the more, the more ceremonial and thelemic and kind of New Age systems. Flowers was instrumental in resurrecting the runes as a very academically precise and completely radically different system, and more traditional system, and one that kind of resisted the syncretism that so many of the other paths of magic were falling into. Or maybe not falling into is the wrong word, but it was just something radically different that people became very, very attracted to and became part of the fabric and the overall tapestry of the occult world. Neither, not Western magic, not Eastern mysticism, but the northern tradition. So he's published 3 dozen books on the northern system and other systems of magic, along with hundreds of other published papers and translations. He also writes under the pen name Edred Thorson, so you probably come across some of his works there. So according to his Wikipedia, he's a former American professor, scholar, runologist, runosophist, Godi, and proponent of occultism, Odianism, esoteric runosophy, German mysticism, Asatru, and Mazdaism, being instrumental in the early establishment of the German neo-pagan movement in North America, and he's also been very active in a number of left-hand path occult organizations. I spoke to him today from Austin, Texas, and he has a new book out called Icelandic Magic, Practical Secrets of the Northern Grimoires, which is from Inner Traditions, which is a look at and resurrection of the early Icelandic grimoires from, the late medieval period, which are similar to, but obviously also very radically different from the more famous European grimoires that were, or Western European grimoires that were circulating around that time or a little bit later. So we had a great conversation. We touched on obviously his new book, An Icelandic Magic. We went into the runic system, the northern system, what it was like to bring it back and bring it out to the wider culture. We talked about the process of awakening as a runic initiate, and also the what that means in our modern world and a very scattered and non-initiated world. What the path of initiation is like. We got into some really, really good territory, not just on the northern system, but on magic in general. And he had some really, really good advice to pass on. So without too much further ado, I definitely want to get you guys straight into that interview. Definitely also want to say that there is currently a sale on at magick.me. It's 60% off the first month to celebrate the summer solstice. That sale goes on till June 26th. So definitely hop in on that. You can use the code solstice when you check out from magick.me, the subscription, monthly subscription, and you'll get 60% off the first month. That'll give you access to everything on the site. There's trainings there on chaos magic, ceremonial magic, I Ching, tarot, banishing rituals, everything in between, far and wide, including lucid dreaming, astral projection, and lots more to come. If you haven't been introduced to magick.me, definitely please download the free ebook that should be linked. You just go to ultraculture.org and you will get the free ebook, Introduction to Sigil Magic, which we talk about a little bit in this podcast, and a free 8 days of courses introducing you to the wide and exciting world of chaos magic and the occult in general. So definitely grab that. And so without further ado, I want to introduce you to Stephen Flowers, who is definitely an acknowledged master of the Northern tradition. So settle in for a great interview. All right, Dr. Flowers, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for being on.
Well, thank you for offering the interview. I'm glad to be here.
Yes, it's an honor to have you on. I was just given your new book, Icelandic Magic, Practical Secrets of the Northern Grimoires by Inner Traditions, and this is so this is more of a straight grimoire, but resurrecting some of the stuff from the Galderbach, I think, and the old Icelandic magic. I'm curious what your take on this stuff is.
Well, it's a vast tradition of magic, that is for sure, and that went for several hundred years in Iceland in a very sort of not totally unique. There were some outliers of that same sort of thing in Scandinavia in general, but not much of that has survived, whereas in Iceland there are many of these books right up until the 20th century, actually, that were being created by active magicians, and it follows a tradition that is very interesting for people today or at any time to work with on a very practical, personal level. Once the sort of, as I put it, the grammar of the system is learned, then you see that these symbols and signs that were used are really expressions of the person's will within a certain grammatical construct. But it's not a grammar of words, but rather of space, lines, geometry, and things of that nature. So it is quite interesting. Even when there are words involved, names and other things, they are reverted into geometrical patterns in a way very similar to the way that the English magician Austin Osman Spare worked, although these people were doing it centuries before that, obviously, but almost the same exact theory as far as part of what they were doing is concerned. They had the same exact sigilization technique, but this is going back to the 1600s.
Wow. So I'm obvious with Spare. He was so idiosyncratic, and when people do sigils now, they are rooted in their own worldview and their current time period. I am curious, in working with this type of material, if there are challenges in bringing over magic from a very different time, place, and worldview, or if it's really not that different.
No, not really. That's one of the nice things about it, is that the verbal symbolism of this type of magic is so simple that it's really kept more to the level of the idea that there is, when these things are put into space, into a two-dimensional space, they are really representing three and more dimensions, but they are drawn on a two-dimensional plane. When that happens, when that occurs, the space that's drawn into has a sort of pattern or map that is in the mind of the magician, an internal area, external, signifying the idea of subjective and objective universes. And so when these lines are made and certain symbols made within these spaces, then the magician's mind is then impressing these ideas, but not in any kind of verbal way, but a completely spatial way, into these pre-existing spaces. So that kind of theory or that kind of idea is not really tied to any specific culture or time period or even mythology. However, I'm doing it within this one because here we have actual historical examples of someone or people who have been doing this, but I don't explicitly come out and say it, but it's obvious that someone could expand these ideas into other areas, very personal in nature, and experiment with it. It's a very experimental kind of magic. It's very pragmatic and experimental.
What are some specific uses of the sigils in the book for specific practical uses?
Yeah, well, what I did here, I wrote a book some years ago called Hermetic Magic, and I did a similar thing there, wherein I used the Greek magical papyri, which are really the root of sort of Western normal Orthodox magic, but few people up until then really knew much about that body of literature. But if you read the actual ones, there's a lot of strange things in there that are just impractical for people to do, or they are just odd or whatever. They're just very difficult for the modern practitioner to do. But there are hundreds of examples. So what I did was I took and I went through and I found the ones that were doable and relevant and practical to do and practical to experiment with, and then based the book on that. And here I did the same kind of thing. The grimoires of the Icelanders, sometimes they require, or they'll say things like, draw this symbol, this stave on a codfish's, a bladder or something.
Okay.
It's like, well, first of all, I don't know whether that's possible. I don't know whether that's really literally meant or not or whatever, but here we'll just say, let's just put that one to the side and not really experiment with that or try to do anything with it. But there are many, many other examples where you can follow the instructions and do so in the same spirit. So that's what I did. I kind of culled through the whole literature of this material and found things that were relevant. I also the most famous of these grimoires, or these books of magic of Icelanders, is a thing that's just generally come to be called the Galdra-bók, which means the book of magic, but every one of these is a Galdra-bók. Became so famous, this one manuscript, that it came to be called the Galdra-bók. And this book was written over a period of several centuries, wherein a magician would make a book, and then somebody else came along and added pages to it until the last part of it is written in a cursive script. It was probably done in Denmark and so forth. So these books actually grew organically from generation to generation. Oh. And so I wanted to get some of that spirit into this book as well, in the sense that some of these experiments in here are things that I have done and found effective, and they are my own things. Most of them, 95% of them, are things taken from actual existing Icelandic books, and then we have there 4 pages that are blank in the book, wherein the reader, the person who's not just reading the book, but who actually wants to engage in this exercise and practice in an active way, can add their own discoveries and put them in the book, and thus create their own Galdra-bók in the same spirit as the ancient or the old books were done. And so that was kind of the theory of how this book was generated. And we have formal kind of ritual activity that you could follow, But I have found that, and as you see how these people actually worked in history, is that you can just do these things on the fly, just while you are just sort of a doodle. As long as you know the grammar of the magic, you can make these things on a piece of scrap paper with a pen. If you know how to put your mind into that activity.
So how do you do that?
Into
how do you put your mind into that activity and flow into it?
Well, through a visualization exercise wherein you actually flow into through the instrument of whatever it is, a pen that you're writing with, let's say, and you're going into that pen, and so your mind, when you were drawing the sigil or drawing this stave, as we'd call it, you are entering into it and following it as if and while you are doing this, you are your point of view, your perspective is from within the symbol, not outside the symbol, but within it. And so you enter into this universe of the symbol itself. And again, the grammar of it is, for example, when I say grammar, you say, well, the space on the paper, the outer part of it is the objective universe. The next inner ring would be the subjective universe, and then your core, the center or the core of the mind of the magician in the middle. And so when lines are made within these spaces, it's analogous to the way that verbs, adverbs, nouns, and so forth work in a sentence. The same kind of theory works on a flat piece of paper, but not in words and not in grammar as far as language is concerned, but rather a grammar of space and lines. And so it is nonverbal. And some people have said, that the alphabet, the runes, things like that, that the alphabet somehow destroyed man's magical power or magical thinking because it broke it down and analyzed things that formerly were seen in symbolically in space and so forth. And that it may or may not be true. I think let's assume that it is true for a second. We look at the tradition of the runes themselves, and we see that is a tradition wherein you have a conscious effort to write, but not to give up that symbolic connectiveness with between the subjective universe of the individual and the objective universe in which the magician is trying to work. That the link is not broken, and how that's done is we see that most alphabetic systems have arbitrary names for their symbols, for the sounds. The Latin alphabet A, B, C, D, or the Greek alphabet Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta. Those don't mean anything to them. Those are based on the Semitic names for the letters, which are meaningless to the Greeks. They're just arbitrary names, abstract and arbitrary. But for example, in the Hebrew alphabet, which is really derived from the general Semitic one, or the runes, we see that the names of the letters have actual meaning. They have symbolic meaning that connect the symbol to the natural world and to the mythic universe in which the writer lives. So that is a writing system which writes like any other, but also doesn't lose that connectedness, and so it remains poetically powerful. Now, this system of the sigils, or the galdrastafir, is more pointed in that direction. It's more does not want to engage in this literal kind of thinking, but rather remains solidly within the symbolic spatial universe.
Huh.
So we see places where, for example, one of the main techniques, one of the best, or one of the ways in which the experimenter can get good results and also act in the tradition of the system, is that we have various names of the god Odin, which are many in number, over 100 different names. We have many of them in the book. And then you transliterate this name and you put it into runes, and then you make a sigil out of these runes, a composite, what's called a bind rune, out of these runes that make up this name, and then stylize that. Again, this is very akin to the technique of Austin Osman Spare, but it was one that was used that we see in old Icelandic books, taking names of Odin, putting them into runes, and then making a symbol out of those runes and stylizing them a little bit further, making them sort of pretty, making them look just to the whim of the person. And so you can't recognize this symbol as being this thing, but it is constructed out of the runes of this name. And so you take these 100 some odd names, each one of which has some kind of specific magical intent or purpose, and that's the whole charm, if you will, of these names of Odin, that he might be called something like let me think about it. Let me see. He might be called something like Bölverker, the worker of evil. Let's say somebody's going to do some malevolent magic, not necessarily something suggested, but that's a name. It's a Bölverker, is a name of Odin, and but it means worker of Baal, worker of evil, if you will. And so well, that's odd, but see, why would he call himself that? Well, that is his name is what he is at that moment, so that when he enters into that being and becomes that thing, then he is that. He is not necessarily doing that, he is that. And so that name and the action and the being are all one. And so here we have a name written in runes, and then we can turn that into a symbol that becomes a magically operative thing. And that's just his names become a catalog of that kind of activity. That's what we see that these in old runic inscriptions, the rune master will call himself by different names, a whole catalog of names, just like the god Odin does. And if we read those names, we see, well, this is the intent of the inscription. It is to do this kind of work. If he says, I am the dangerous one, then it's about like, watch out, this inscription is meant to protect this place, and if you break it, if you destroy it, if you destroy the sacrality of this place, then there'll be consequences. And so he calls himself by a name that embodies that power. And that's the way Odin is in the mythology, and that's the way we see that rune masters depicted themselves with this same kind of naming practice within inscriptions. Sometimes several names are used, none of which were what their mother called them. They were initiatory or magical names, akin to the names of Odin, not necessarily identical with them, but in the same spirit as these names were.
Okay. Great. Wonderful. So I maybe want to take it back a little bit further, because I think a lot of people listening to this podcast may be new to new to your work and new to the runes. And I'm curious, you were obviously instrumental in bringing the runes, kind of resurrecting the runic system as a magical system and bringing it to the wider culture. And I'm curious, I want to hear about what your process was like with that, of your academic work in the 70s, bringing the runes and then bringing the runes into a working magical system, founding the Rune Guild, and bringing the runes back to the world as a living magical system. I'm curious what that process has been like for you and how you've seen interest change over time and people's approach to it, how they've received it, how that's changed over time.
Okay. It was really a matter of, I don't know what to call it, as far as some people might say it was luck. I don't know. I think that I might have been, at least to some extent, directed unconsciously to being in certain places at certain times and so forth to make this process happen. But I came to Austin, Texas, from Dallas and to go to school, and I had interest in German and German language. I'd gone to Germany, lived in Germany for a while, learned German. But it was not really. I was always interested in sort of occult things. I liked different, like horror movies and all that kind of thing as a kid and whatever. But nothing was really all that focused. And so when I came here, I got deeper into that sort of thing. But it was again just sort of like it was a sort of manifestation of the zeitgeist of the early 1970s. A lot of people were into this. At the University of Texas, you could get courses in Kabbalah and alchemy and you name it. It was just the professors were offering these courses because that's what the students wanted, as elective courses. It was just that popular and that much a part of the culture of the time. 90% of the people, of course, left all that behind, but it was at the time that kind of thing. So I was in this kind of world, and I was interested in German, and I knew the German language fairly well at that point. And so I was just kind of on a trip once, and it was kind of a wild goose chase trip to look for a Tibetan monk. It was just kind of crazy, 1970s junk like that.
Okay.
But then just something came to me, like a word was spoken to me. I heard this one word, which was runa. And I basically knew what that was. I knew about, the runes, sort of. But so I then, next day, I went to the library and started looking up books on runes. And of course, 90% of these books were in German. The good thing was I knew German well enough to read them. Most of them had been unlooked at by anything but scholars for a long time. And so this began my journey. And that's the way it began, was that I had this interest, had this inspiration, and had the resources right there in this monstrous library wherein all of this material was stored. And then beyond that, there were these professors here, and one of them is the great Indo-Europeanist and Germanist Edgar Ptolemy. And I studied with him, and I just began I'm going to study here what my passion is, which became runes. And so then I followed that to the highest level of education, in which I finally acquired a PhD in Germanic languages with a dissertation entitled Runes and Magic. And so that was the academic side. And then on the active side, on the practical side, I developed in parallel with that a kind of an inner development which mirrored my own. First I worked on myself, then when I had my own process controlled enough, and developed enough, then I started to share it, and then founded the Rune Guild, which was a idea was to get people who were also doing or trying to do the same thing involved in a kind of an initiatory system, and that has developed over the years, and so that's the way I looked at my whole process. It was one that was different, I would say, from the standard sort of occult pathway, in which there is something where what is being worked on is something odds with the scholarly viewpoint on a subject, and rather, in my case, it's something which is very much in tune with what the scholar would say about the topic, and that we would explore that viewpoint in a inner way to discover what we were looking for, which is the mystery, the rune. That was what the significance of that word was. Runa is the mystery, the unknown, and the idea that that's what we seek. That's what these ancient rune masters were seeking, was this, the unknown, the secret, the mystery. And that's why they called these symbols mysteries, because they revealed something, but they also concealed things that were eternal mysteries. And so that is sort of, in a nutshell, what that whole process, personal and beyond, is all about.
Wow. Amazing. So I'm curious, is there, in talking about your early initiatory experiences in accessing the system, is there an awakening process in the runic system, similar to, I think probably like an awakening in the Eastern Tantric systems, or an awakening even in the Setian sense? Is there a specific, initiatory opening to the runic system that people undergo, and what is that?
Yes,
like?
well, yeah, that's what is called the rune rensla, the runic experience. In my case, it was this utterance of the word runa to me. And as I've often said, and when I would speak, people say, well, the god Ooga Booga from the planet Zontrar, was speaking to me the other day, and he dictated this 20,000-page book to me.
Yes.
And usually it's like, that sounds like Madame Blavatsky to me. But anyway, that kind of a thing. And I will always say, so if a god really speaks to you, one word is sufficient. One word will last you a lifetime, if it's really, something like that. And that's the way runa is. There's one word like a seed planted, then a whole lifetime to unpack that, to analyze that, to realize and to understand the significance of that. That is a runic experience of the mystery. And then you have many sort of insights, moments of insight along the way. And a lot of times these are involved with meeting certain people who, as Gurdjieff would tell us, in order to go to the next higher level, you have to have contact with a person on that level. And that's not just in the world of mysticism, magic, and initiation, but education, anything. That's one of the terrible things about this world that we're entering into, that we've fallen into with all of this technology and so forth. And so, you'll get your degree online. Oh, God.
Yes.
It's like the 80% of what you get through traditional education, if you have access to teachers, is the contact with these people as human beings. Not recordings of them, not films of them, not broadcasts of them, but actual connection with them, actually being in their presence and knowing them as real humans, that contact with that, as Gurdjieff would call it, the higher man, because it's like electricity, or like a weather pattern. It goes from high pressure to low pressure, right?
Okay.
And so contact with these people, and I remember many times, sometimes with Dr. Polomé, for example, or with other people, there's just something I could feel, it's just something strange is happening here. It just happens this one time, and then it just goes on. But there are these contacts and these moments of insight that come from these contacts, and I think that's all been the same forever, from caveman days to the present. But I think that people believing that they can get this kind of thing online or from a book or something like that is a kind of a not too positive a development. I think
Right.
You can get these things from beyond and from books and so forth and so on, or someone might be able to, but to say that's the normal way to do it is, I think, a disservice to people.
Yes.
I mean, it's like saying you're interested in music? Well, Mozart was composing at 5. Why aren't you? I mean, he did it, right? So, I mean, it can be done. So just go right ahead. As opposed to saying, oh, well, you're interested in music. Well, here's your piano teacher. Here's your scales. Here's learning. You're going to get more competent musicians out of the process, whereby there is a way of teaching in an orderly kind of curriculum. Then you're just going to say, well, if we're going to have music, we're going to have to wait for another Mozart.
Well,
right?
I think the good thing about online is it allows access to all of this material, even academic. In my work, just finding academic even research material. There's so much more access to information than there was before, and also it allows people to connect, at least at a superficial level. And it's a good way to get started. There's so much you can learn online to get started. But I definitely remember I've seen such a change in the occult world. 10, 15 years ago, before social media, really, the occult experience was so much based around, joining small groups and initiatory orders and pseudo-Masonic bodies. And in my life, I had so many intense and meaningful and incredible experiences that way, and also, destructive experiences and negative experiences.
Sure.
But there's all kinds of, mayhem that goes on in occult groups. But
that's what all makes it fun. That's what makes it. Without that, there's no interest. I read this website. What's the history of your order? Well, I read this website, and then I printed this book, and then it's like, well, nothing happened. Nothing is interesting. There's no drama. There's no. And I'm not saying all that's good, but it is vibrant. It is real. It is intense.
And
how much intensity have we lost?
Yes, it seems to have definitely been cut off in many ways because of and a lot of what I've been trying to do, and I've been teaching courses online and trying to at least reach more people with the internet. But definitely, I feel not just in occult groups, but a culture in general, that really people are not meeting each other face to face, and there seems a lot has been lost, because I remember in the late 90s, early 2000s even, there was this real sense of an underground and this other world you could go into and meet intelligent people and have these intense experiences that were so far outside of mainstream, American or otherwise life. And now that's kind of been flattened out, and I kind of resent that.
Yeah, or the bizarre experiences of certain things that you had to really work to get into now are just commercially available. They will just put out these. They say, "Oh, come on!" And people are so you don't have to work or to even have luck out or do anything to find these sort of cracks. Somebody's out there marketing the idea that these things are available for the right price, And so I think that too has made people be confused as to what is real and not real and so forth. I mean, it's a sorcerer's paradise now, because people can create reality, but not a magician's paradise. It is where things can be, where illusion can be much more easily manufactured.
Yes.
Just think of how people can appear to be. If you have the right website, you can appear to be a very successful, numerous, whatever. You can create any illusion you want. But so those things are. I think that a technique or whatever, where you take advantage of the media and the whole digital universe, but also have the other thing, is just simply putting, if you had something wherein you said, here's where we convey, just like books. I wrote an article for the Rune Guild many years ago on computers, books, and whatever. Books are no computers and websites. At that time, they were websites. I wrote this article many years ago. But are all, this impersonal, non-contact way. A book is not better than or worse than a website or the wiki page or whatever.
Right.
It's all the same. All the computer has done is put books on a screen. It's no more or less anything.
Yes.
So the information is easier to get out there unfiltered by people who know what they're doing, true, on the internet, but nevertheless, it's in theory the same.
Yes.
So if you do that and you say, well, here's how we convey the basics, like 9 Doors of Midgard, and vis-a-vis the Rune Guild. Here's the 9 Doors of Midgard. You don't need a person to guide you along the way like a guru, oh, look, you need to sit this way and do this, and, every little detail of your life in this kind of world we live in. So we have this basic curriculum, but that doesn't then say you can do the whole thing and every part of it without ever meeting or ever encountering another person.
Right. Yeah, I think that there's even when it was just books, there was such a huge leap from reading somebody's, you could read somebody's complete works and start working through the material, but then actually meeting them, then you get it in context, and just and not even the magic per se, but just watching how somebody lives their life.
Yes.
And
many times I had people say, well, I'm a big fan. I've read all your books and everything. And then I will do an hour or a couple hour talk with her. And I'll say, oh, wow, I'd never understood or realized this, that, and the other. So I'm thinking it's all in the book, but they don't. It's all the pennies drop somehow.
Yes.
For people. And it becomes a totally different kind of knowledge for them. And I've seen that with others, you see. And I always think, I think that's true, all that's true, yet of course, we make of ourselves exceptions. And I will say that I have had many experiences wherein I will be reading some old book, and I will be reading along with this person, and I'm thinking, and then suddenly the same kind of penny drops, and I understand this whole, and then I really know what's going to be in the rest of the book. I know what's going to, the next page is going to say, because that person's mind and my mind were so much on the same wavelength, or I got so much on the same wavelength by understanding where this person was coming from, that I got their worldview,
Okay.
I got their paradigm, or as Heinlein would say, I grokked him.
Yes.
and then once that happens, it's easier to do in person, but you can do it through books. But I don't know. I think that most people, have difficulty doing so.
Yeah, for me,
Again, it's like the Mozart example.
absolutely. For me, the
Yeah.
best way to grok things, as Highline said, is is meeting people, definitely, who are living embodiments of systems. B is group magic, group ritual, because you pick up the vibe, so quickly off other people. I think
Hmm.
C, definitely the psychedelic experience, and
Right.
and finally putting myself in after going through all that, it was definitely putting myself in situations where I had to do effective magic to make it through, basically, putting myself in really tough learning experiences.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
And none of that is conveyed on a website, but you can get the basics, obviously. But
Right. Right.
it
Right.
definitely takes meeting people and putting the effort in.
Each thing has its place. So a website, et cetera, just fills in the space of what books used to be.
Yes.
And so there's nothing super. I love books because that's the way I grew up. I didn't grow up around it and didn't know what a website was. So I still have that. But I also realize that theoretically there's little difference between the two. Except I still think that a website you can search easier and find things if you digitally, but at the same time, it's the knowledge doesn't seem as global to me as if when I have the book or books. I can get
Right.
more information even now just because of my background and training from having 10 books open around me than sitting in front of a computer. You know what I mean?
Right.
If they're the right books.
Absolutely. Well, let me ask you this. Let's say somebody
Mhm.
gets access to they've not only read the material, but speaking of the runic system specifically, but they have access to somebody who can pass on, the vibe, pass on the real sense of it, and they get into the initiatory current properly and are working it effectively. What changes do you see that system produce in people over time? Let's say over 5, 10, 15 years. What are the initiatory flowerings from that? No pun intended. From that system that emerge in somebody's personality over time.
Well, I think that one becomes the word that most people shrink from or have a horror of today is wisdom, which is a kind of mindset which is confident about one's own insights, that one exists within reality, the true and higher reality, yet at the same time is not bothered by or insulted by or in any way offended by anything the world has to offer. Because you know that these things are just the way of the world. So that frees up when one is no longer angered by the what you feel like is terrible, wrong, and people like today are so balled up in the political this, that, and the other thing,
Yes.
and the hatred and
Yes.
the polarization and the this and the that, and spending so much energy and not really seeing reality for what it is, because they themselves do not exist or live within a real space. An initiate exists within a real space. And when you are in that real space, then a lot of things can be, you don't say, well, that doesn't irrelevant. You still say, well, we want to bring more reality to the world, but at the same time, when confronted with something which is an affront to that, if you then become angry or very upset, by the existence of this other point of view or something like that, then you've just disarmed yourself totally, And so that's true of your own aims and direction in your life and so forth, that you will become a individual which can accomplish whatever is necessary to accomplish. And once that is understood, then life is lived from a totally different perspective than it had been lived formerly.
Huh. So, in that sense, would you say that that it would be like a non-dual system or a non-dual view on reality?
Well, I wouldn't say it's non-dual in the sense that whether we're talking about the Germanic system or the Mazdan system or whatever, it doesn't mean that evil doesn't exist. That is, that there's not stupidity, ignorance, sickness, poverty, all things we want to avoid for ourselves and avoid for the world. But to be emotionally affronted by these things rather than saying, I am confronted with poverty. What I need to overcome it is money, or for myself, and ways for others to become prosperous so that they overcome poverty. It's not getting mad at somebody over there that I'm going to blame for making this person poor, or whatever kind of misdirection I fall victim to, Rather, I'm going to confront this I'm going to confront these shortcomings, these things which are characterized by either a deficiency or an excess. That is the Germanic and the Indo-European idea of what is evil, what is bad. It is a excess or a deficiency of something. Balance is the good. There are German words for bad, übel, our word evil, which just means overmuch of something. That's all the word evil means. It's like water is good, but if you're in the middle of the ocean with no life vest and you're drowning, water is very bad. Too much. Too much of a good thing. Too much of a necessary thing. But it's overabundance of something that is out of balance with your life necessities. And then too little, like German words like schlimm and schlecht, meaning bad, are our words slim and slight. They're deficiencies. They're too much, or too little of something. And so that, whereas balance is the good. So therefore, that once that is understood, then we see again a different kind of attitude towards what it is we want to be, become, and what want the world to be and to become.
Wonderful. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the god Odin, and if he exemplifies, or if becoming Odin more like Odin exemplifies this path.
Well, like I said about his names, right? They run this spectrum of being, so that the initiate, the Odinic initiate, becomes someone who has the full spectrum of possibilities of being at his or her disposal, you see. So that this is more of a fulfillment of being rather than a refinement where you just focus on one kind of way of being. Rather, one should become a sort of a spectrum of essence rather than a monotone of essence. And that is peculiar or particular to the god Odin, who is this god of runes who's undergone this initiation of discovering the runes, of discovering the mysteries, yet this god is also always seeking to discover something, always seeking to discover more knowledge and discover the way in which to overcome the effects of the destruction of the world in order to survive it and survive the destruction of the world and recreate a new world beyond that. And that whole paradigm that we see in the Ragnarok myth is something which most people are misinterpret as something akin to, and I think probably even the Christian or the Judeo-Christian, I suppose purely Christian myth of the apocalypse has been misinterpreted as being something. And with the Germanic world, it's more clear, or we can look at it more clearly. With the other, it's so fraught with so much history and nonsense that it's hard to see it for what it is. But in both cases, I think what it is a pattern, paradigm, or recipe for how things change, how things are transformed from one state of being to another. When another state of being arises, the old state of being is destroyed or left behind. We have witnessed in our own lifetimes the destruction and new worlds arising out of things like the fall of the Soviet Union. When I was growing up, I thought those Russians, they're going to be there forever. The Soviet Union, the Communist Party, that's going to be there forever. What? And no, it just like collapses virtually overnight into something else. As that world for them changed, that universe changed. Things like that happen. How does it happen? When it'll happen regardless, but the Ragnarok myth is a pattern for people who know how to make these changes occur and how to ride that wave to a positive, beneficial, by positive I mean beneficial outcome. Changes are going to occur, but usually in your life, in the world, but if they occur and you don't know how to come out on the other side in a better position, then it might be a worse position. You see, I have to be aware of the patterns, and that's what I think these myths were put down into poetic form in a way to guide the initiates of that world into seeing how this kind of process occurs and how to turn it to your benefit. For example, we're talking about the god Odin. If you read, say, well, Odin is in Ragnarok is said to be, quote, killed or eaten or whatever by the Fenris wolf. The wolf swallows Odin. Yet he has engendered a son well before this called Vidar, who has been engendered for the sole purpose of avenging his father. And see, he has foreseen this end, and he has seen that he says this Vidar has been engendered in order to avenge me. He has built up his shoe, the heel of his shoe with all the shoe leather that people throw away in making shoes, to make this huge heel. Why? So he can stick that on the bottom of the Fenris wolf's jaw when he rips him wide open. Now, all those details all seem like a fairy tale, and it is akin to a fairy tale. Which fairy tale? Little Red Riding Hood.
Okay.
Little Red Riding Hood. The wolf swallows her and the grandmother. The woodsman comes along, rips the wolf open, and the Little Red Riding Hood and the grandmother emerge. Okay, now that's really a story. Little Red Riding Hood is a story about transformation, about a little girl becoming a woman, getting her first period. There's a lot of blood when the wolf is ripped open, and and that's what that story is about. But it's a paradigm that goes back further than that, and there we see in the Edda and this story about Odin being swallowed by the wolf. Again, he's ripping the wolf open. Why is he ripping him open? It must be to allow the god to reemerge. Now, he does reemerge, but in the mythology, he reemerges in the form of a reborn god called Heinir, which means the master of the mind. Odin means like the master of inspiration. Heinir is a master of the mind. Now, Heinir in the mythology is a total blank slate. He's supposed to be the wisest of all gods because he's the mind master, as it were. But he never can say anything. The people ask him questions. He says, I don't know. Let Mimir decide. Let someone. I can't think. I'm nothing. I don't know. He just has that kind of a being. But when after Ragnarok, this Heinir character suddenly becomes all wise, and what does he do? He starts to read the runes. Odin. So he's been transformed, reborn, emerged in a transformed state beyond death into a new world. And that's just an esoteric yet rooted in the actual text interpretation of what is going on in this whole myth. And that is about how these patterns that are described in these obtuse, difficult to understand poems are things which are actually practical blueprints for transformation and what to do with it.
Wow, amazing. Yeah, I often look at these cultural systems, particularly obviously magical systems from any culture, and they look to me like, particularly working with them over time and engaging in the mythology, and then particularly looking at them through the lens of the psychedelic experience. They're just these massive storehouses, and I don't know if you agree with this or not, but they seem to me to be these gigantic storehouses of wisdom and patterns of life that were passed down from cultures on how life works, encoded in mythology and symbol sets. But people look at them and they have this Hollywood view of magic as, I do something from a spell book and I get X result, which can work, but also what it's really about, at least for me, is just engaging with these massive, as you say, patterns of information on what from the ancestors, essentially, or what life was like, and how to apply these to live life without falling into suffering as much as possible. How to dance with life properly.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's the distinction between magic and sorcery. That is, a magician it's really understanding of the things you just spoke about. That is, and how to live life so that the things that you need will come to you naturally because you have attuned your being with those things, and so that you have become initiated with this link. Some people will just see it as a separate thing, but if you see this will you enter the process engaged in this idea that your mythic paradigm, your model of understanding is one which is connected to all phases of life, then these things can come about. If you see it as something like a monk in the Christian tradition, I'm just suffering now, so I'll get reward later, rather than just I'm going to become the thing which is good, balanced, and live in a way which naturally reaps the reward here, there, and everywhere, because I am in this state of, or I seek to be in this state of being, which is receptive to these things. And so I don't have to say, oh my gosh, I don't have a girlfriend, I better do a spell to get one. Oh my God, I don't have any money, I better do a spell to get some. Right. You know, that's sorcery, and that is so subject to the sorcerer's apprentice syndrome. That is, I'm not wise enough to know what it is I need. I don't know what I need. So if I do, say I'm an 18-year-old kid, I don't know what I need. I think I need X, Y, and Z when I really need A, B, and C. So I'm going to do spells, and if I am unfortunate enough to be a talented sorcerer, I'm going to get X, Y, and Z and be saddled with X, Y, and Z for the rest of my life, probably. You know, and so that the greatest blessing is being untalented and not getting what it. But if you are good and you have your talent for sorcery and you do this thing, you can go right down the wrong. And that's what the whole Golem myth, Sorcerer's Apprentice, Golem, Frankenstein, that your creation will come back to destroy you. You know, and so that is. Something that initiatory path will avoid. Now, what sorcery and doing things like things that are outlined in Icelandic Magic, I try to avoid those things, you know, that are, that would cause problems, I think. And but you can see the technique. It's kind of like going back to the musician example. It's like sorcery, little sorceries, are like doing the scales, right? You learn, you say, see how if I do this, I get some feedback from the universe that this symbolic communication system really works. Yes. And so I get these little examples. I can events, I can see, I can do these things, and so forth. Now, I don't want to just keep doing that and become addicted to that. Rather, I want to then apply this to a bigger problem, a more global life problem, initiation, and use those same techniques for that. And then all of a sudden things start coming to me when I need them, to the degree I need them. And so that is much better, you know, than go leaping and lurching. I mean, we have a whole country that is exists on sorcery. Yes, that is, it lurches from crisis to crisis, and flitters about with no direction or understanding at all. Yes. You know,
absolutely.
It's just, how can I put out this fire? How can I get out of this trouble? How can I, that kind of a thing. Individuals exist on that level, obviously also, but it's not, it doesn't seem wise.
I think that's beautifully put. But let me ask you this. Maybe we should look at this from the other angle, which is, how do you feel about when people over-mythologize their lives? Because then I see the tendency on the other side, and obviously I've done this as well, is to over-mythologize every little thing and be kind of reading too much into existence, and not necessarily doing sorcery, but obviously the classic example is the Oath of the Abyss, and Frater Akkad, and is I guess the poster boy for this. But I think obviously in the occult scene, it's very easy to fall into reading meaning into every little incident that occurs that's maybe not there, and maybe not doing enough results magic, either literally or figuratively, in the sense of being too passive and waiting for life to come to you instead of actively engaging with it.
Well, I think all of those things, all of the examples and things you're talking about fall into that category of how you can have too much or too little of something and be out of balance, and therefore get into a bad way because there's too much of something or too little of something. So that, for example, the idea that there's meaning involved in things as this kind of the Magister Template kind of mythology, right? I mean, as far as like, you want to say, okay, like Crowley's example where he said, well, there's a garden snail crawling across my path. The Magister Templi is going to say, what does that garden snail mean? Whereas the Magus is going to say, how can I use that garden snail to further my word? That kind of a thing. But those, all of which may be examples of people who are over-mythologizing, and maybe. But nevertheless, so you see that there are phases or stages or different valiances of this kind of activity. But I think all of it, no matter what it is, should be governed by this idea of there being a kind of a golden mean applied, wherein a balanced, there can be too much or too little of anything, and too much or too little of any kind of way of thinking leads to madness.
Right. So, what would you say a well-balanced, what would a well-balanced runic initiate look like?
What would he look like? Well, he or she, too bad we're not on Skype. Who could look at me? But
well, I'm sure people can Google image search when they're reading the.
Well, no, that's. Well, I think that's that we exist in a heroic, mythic world, but don't take yourself too seriously either. That this is normal, that this is we want to restore a normalcy of people living heroic and mythic lives, that this is the way human beings should be, that someone who is pursuing that is an oddball weirdo in today's world is not is just a statement about the world, not the goodness or rightness of that kind of point of view or that kind of life. But that is someone who is understand that they seek the unknown, they seek the mystery. They know that they will never uncover it at all, and are content with their discontent, and that they want to bring this to the world. They want to bring the benefit of this to a wider world and not reject the world around them, so that there is a social or cultural kind of conscience about the runic initiate, of going back to Odin. Odin is trying to do seeking the unknown and living an extreme lifestyle, if you could say that if he were a man, living an extreme lifestyle, lurching from extreme to extreme and being balanced therein. But what he seeks and what he is working towards and for are for the benefit of the world. His very beginning, in which he looks and says, oh my gosh, look at the world, when they come into being, this Odin, Vili, Vie beings, when come into being as the first true gods, and he looks at the world and he goes, this is a pile of crap. This emir universe that exists around me is chaotic and nonsensical and violent and horrible. I'm going to kill this character, this emir, which is, of course, a great and horrible sin, killing your ancestor, killing a kinsman. And out of his body, I'm going to make a new world. I'm going to recreate the world out of his parts. It's going to be a rational and beautiful world. But this is what I've got to work with, so this is what I'm going to work with. But he's a revolutionary. It's like Thomas Jefferson, right? This world is crap. This king, we got to get rid of him.
Yes.
And we're going to rebuild it, and it's going to look like this. And here's the paradigm that we're going to use. So it's that kind of heroic, world-transforming, but to the benefit of the world, not to its detriment. But one has to become and be knowledgeable, wise, etc., has to work within in order to then export this to working on in the world around you. But I think that you see these mythic paradigm. When you look at these old Norse poems, you see, well, this pattern is the same one you see here, there, and in these other places. It's kind of a, for example, here, Odin as a antinomian figure. The rule and the law of his universe was that created by Ymir. Yet he has because of his inner knowledge and wisdom as a conscious being, the first of them, can see that this is not right. This is not the way it ought to be. And I'm going to, knowing that, I will now have the confidence to change it.
Yes. Yes.
And not just passively say, oh, well, that's the way it is. I guess I got to live with it. So that whole spirit, that animates us culturally is really seen exemplified in these myths.
Amazing. So excellent. So we're getting close to the end of we're past an hour, but I wanted to just ask a few quick fire questions.
Okay.
So the first one would be, what is the hardest lesson you've ever learned in magic? The hardest lesson you've ever had to learn?
That you better know what it is you need rather than what you want. Okay. And so you better, and that's it.
Okay.
It's
yes, definitely. Then the second, the second one was, what is one magical technique that you could not do without? Whether that's a direct sorcery technique or maybe just a bit of insight or wisdom that helps you day to day.
Well, that would be the memorization and absorption of ordered symbol systems. That be whether that's the runes or the sirosa mantras of the Mazdan tradition or whatever. There's an ordered, coherent system of symbols that have a certain order, certain number and place. That is essential to initiation and to magic. Otherwise, you just begin to swim in your own subjective universe and are, of course, subjected to your own unconscious whims, and you go nowhere.
Okay. Excellent. And then the last thing is, if there's one thing that you wish, or if there's one thing that you could say to everyone in the world, that you could have everyone in the world realize, what would it be?
Rein til runa. Seek the mysteries.
Amazing. All right. Well, Dr. Flowers, it's been an amazing interview, and I really wanted to thank you for coming on. And your new book is Icelandic Magic, Icelandic Magic: Practical Secrets of the Northern Grimoires, which is out now from Indus Traditions. And did you want to mention where other people can find out more about you, or anything else you wanted to point people towards?
You can go about a lot of my other books. Most of them are available, Amazon, wherever. But we also have a website called Seek the Mystery, seekthemystery.com. So that's the phrase, Seek the Mystery, which I just mentioned. And that you can get a lot of the more obscure books and things like that there. And then we have a new project we're undertaking. We have a Facebook page called the Occidental Temple of the Wise Lord, which is an attempt. We're now in the process of a brave new experiment to expand our vision beyond the Germanic and into the greater Indo-European pantheon and world with a Mazdan vision, and there you can find out more about that at the Occidental Temple of the Wise Lord on Facebook.
All right. Well, thank you again for being on the show.
Okay, thank you,
right.
Jason.
Thanks.
Okay.